Okay, thank you for coming out, everyone. I'm so happy to see so many students here. It's a very special opportunity. Our speaker, Michael Balick, is the Vice President for Botanical Science at the New York Botanical Garden, which is one of the three major botanical gardens in the world, the others being the Missouri Botanical Garden and Kew Gardens in England. It's an internationally renowned research center. And he's not only the Vice President for Botanical Science, but he is also the Philecology Curator and the Director of the Institute for Economic Botany. He also is perhaps arguably the best known ethnobotanist in the world. His professor at Harvard Graduate School was a famous man named Richard Evans Schultes, who's sort of the father of the field. So he has a distinguished intellectual lineage. He's worked on projects with indigenous people in Central America, South America. He's done research for the National Cancer Institute, looking at active compounds in plants, looking for perhaps plants with potential for medicine. He's studied Ayurvedic medicine in India. He's had extensive research in the South Pacific. And all around the world, he leaves a wonderful trail of achievement and validation of a native understanding of ecology. So I'm really so delighted to welcome
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for a brief introduction, by the way. I was once offered a chance to speak to the Royal Society of Medicine in London, and there were these 500 English physicians in the audience, and I got up to be introduced, and the moderator said, "Well, Dr. Balick's going to tell us about this. He's going to tell us about that. He's going to tell us, and then he's going to give data on this and that." And 20 minutes later, he'd given my whole talk, you know? And what would you do, right? So I got up very humbly and I said, "In conclusion." So I thank you for allowing me to give my talk, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight to share these few moments. This is a campus and a program I admire very much. I have a lot of friends here, a lot of old friends and colleagues, folks that I've known for decades. We've been through a lot together. We have been planning a remarkable program that would sort of intersect with what I'm going to talk about tonight. We've had a lot of meetings, a lot of planning sessions, a lot of dreams, and you know, I know what's happened, and I'm as crushed as you are. But there's still hope, and maybe we can implement some of those programs and dreams between the university and the New York Botanical Garden. And so, you know, as to the students, as you move forward in your careers, remember that you only fail when you stop trying, so just keep going. I'd like to sort of have a conversation with you tonight, more than a formal lecture, and could we turn the lights down a little bit? And I'd like to talk about this work that I've been privileged to do for now more than 3 decades. Does this disappear too, or do we live with this? And this is ethnobotany. Ethnobotany is the study of the relationship between plants, people, and culture. That's what I am doing. And as Mary mentioned, I'd like to pay tribute to my professor, Richard Evans Schultes, from Harvard University, here shown on the left after 2 days of dancing in the Rio Guayacá of Colombia, the northwest Amazon, in celebration of the harvest of the peach palm, Bactris gassipes. And what I learned from Professor Schultes was that after I did my 2 years of classes in graduate school, he said, "Now go out and learn something. You're going to the Amazon. Come back when you have a dissertation." And this is a man, again, the one on the left is the Harvard professor. The other are Yukuna and Tunamuka people from the northwest Amazon. This was a man that in the early 1940s got a 1-year leave of absence to go to the Amazon from Harvard University. And it wasn't until 14 years later that a Harvard bureaucrat found this little piece of paper in the file of one Richard Evans Schultes, that he was away for 14 years, and then they called him back. So, you know, just a wonderful gig if you can ever get something like that. You can lower these lights if that'll be helpful. Can everyone see these? So what we've tried to do at the New York Botanical Garden is really be inspired by Schultes' work, emphasizing field programs with indigenous peoples around the world. And our staff, while small, really focus in this tropical region of the world. And you see we have one project in New York in the city working with the Dominican community. We have a 600,000 plus community of Dominicans who travel back and forth to the island of Manhattan, from Manhattan back to the DR and back, and bring plants with them and really keep their cultural traditions with them. And can you tell me why that's going off and on? Or? Oh, okay, we could turn it off if you want. That'd be great. So, ethnomedicine is what I do, and that's the study of the dynamic relationship between people, environment, culture, and healing practices. So that's what I'm focused on, and that's really what we're going to talk about tonight. We know that traditional medical knowledge is declining, but first, what I'm going to try to do with you is talk about what it is, why is it threatened, and what can be done to help keep it in practice. That's the focus of my work at the Botanical Garden. Why is it endangered? Well, if we look at the rates of deforestation and desertification worldwide, you see the red areas are severe deforestation, more than 1.5% of the total land area being deforested each year. The green area is called moderate, 0.5% to 1.5%. 1% being lost every year. Desertification, land being converted to desert. The yellow area is severe desertification, more than 0.5% of that land being converted to desert every year. And moderate desertification is shown in orange, with less than 0.5% being converted to desert every year. So this is finals time, right? If you were giving us a grade for stewardship of the earth and we showed you this, how would we do? Yeah, well, I would say fail, yeah. So if we look at a place like the Atlantic Coastal Forest, home to some of the most extraordinary mammals on the planet, like these little lemurs, tamarins, yes, sorry. I'm a botanist, and Mary and I work together really well because she's always helping me with animal stuff. You see in 1945, this extension of Atlantic Coastal Forest was pretty fairly intact. The rate of endemism here in plants is extraordinary. And you see what happened by 1990, those little tiny patches of green left. And that's being repeated all over the world. And that's the battle we're in to conserve wilderness areas. Another factor is the disappearance of languages on Earth. There are about 6,800 languages spoken on Earth today, and estimates vary widely, but one of them that is credible says that only 600 of those languages have enough speakers to remain intact by the end of this century. And that's pretty frightening. So when you lose your ability to speak your language, you lose your ability to communicate your legends, your lore, the uses that your grandmother made for these plants, the traditional ways that you've managed habitat all of these years in a sustainable way. You lose your ability to transmit your culture. So biological diversity disappearing, cultural diversity disappearing. And this is the phenomenon of devolution. Devolution. With modernization, it may be that knowledge about living things has decreased, or as we say here, devolved. And I'd like to give you an example of that from the Pacific, and that is from the island of Pohnpei, where I'll be talking about tonight towards the end of the talk. These are voyaging peoples. These are peoples that cast off from land masses such as Indonesia to the east, exploring for new islands centuries ago, colonizing these islands, for example, Micronesia. These are voyaging peoples that fish from the sea, they travel in canoes, they live for the sea. And that is a skill that's disappearing, the ability to make a canoe, and I'll show you in a moment the results of our study. Another traditional skill that's involved with devolution is preserving breadfruit. Who's eaten breadfruit here? Anybody? A couple people? Well, you can take that breadfruit from a tree and you can bury it underground like this, and it'll last up to 90 years in the tropics with no preservation from refrigeration or anything like that, or freeze drying. And that's important because if you have a typhoon that wipes out your island, there's nothing to eat, right? You open your breadfruit pit and you survive. You don't have a breadfruit pit, you die. Okay, so this fermentation process is an old traditional skill that's disappearing. So what I did, I teach a course in ethnobotany at the College of Micronesia. It's a 2-year community college that is for the federated states of Micronesia, the 4 islands of Micronesia, of the federated states. And I pose these questions to my students. Do you know the plants used in canoe making, and have you made a canoe? Do you know how to plant taro? Do you know how to ferment breadfruit to preserve it as a survival food? Do you know how to use land plants to catch fish? Do you know how to use sea plants to catch turtle? Turtle is a food for these people. And what I did was we also surveyed the knowledge of the grandparents and the parents, and you'll see for each of these skills, the trends are going downward. In fact, canoe making, which is this orange line here, not a single one of my students knew how to make a canoe, knew the plants used to make a canoe, had ever made a canoe, and these are voyaging peoples, right? So what we were able to do in a paper published in Economic Botany was take the slope of those curves and predict that canoe making and plants used to catch sea turtles were 2 skills that were going to die with these students unless there was an intervention, whereas planting taro, their main food, was something that would last out many generations. So this little exercise directed the trajectory of our research and our cultural interventions, finding the things that were most in danger of being lost. Now, let's start the talk out. There are 2 pieces to this talk. One, the work in Belize, as Mary mentioned, for the National Cancer Institute, and the other, the work in Micronesia. So the story starts when we got a contract in 1986 to provide plant materials for the National Cancer Institute screening program looking to find therapeutics for HIV and cancer. And these were the 16 areas, countries that we worked in over a 10-year period. The New York Botanical Garden has a exploration program unparalleled by any other institution in this hemisphere, where we are on the ground in many, many places studying plants, writing floras, looking at the molecular biology of these plants, their phylogeny, their evolution, and what I specialize in, their uses. So we collected from these countries, and in this area there are 90,000 species of higher plants, plants with flowers or fruits, cones. And we were only given the resources to collect about 500 species a year. So we came up with a strategy to try and maximize the identification of plants that would have biological activity in the 40 screens, the assays of the National Cancer Institute for cancer and antiviral assays for HIV. The first strategy is a random sample. Imagine that you're looking down on a forest. You go in, you lay out a hectare plot of ground, and you collect everything in fruit or flower. Okay? And then we give it to the Cancer Institute. Totally random sample. Why fruit or flower, by the way? Anybody know? Because as botanists, you need fruits or flowers to identify the species. And if you spend a year studying a species, you better know what it is, because you've got to get more and take it into clinical trials. So the identification is really important. The next strategy is to go into that same patch of forest, but collect plants that are known to be from families that have biological activity. So you know that the poinsettia family, the Euphorbiaceae, is rich in biological activity. So you collect all members of that family. The third strategy is the one I do. Plants used by traditional healers. Go into that patch of forest with an elder, a man or woman, who's been providing primary health care to their community for decades, and have them identify the plants that are active, that they use in their practice, and perhaps those would give us a higher hit rate in these bioassays in the pharmacological laboratories. So this is my colleague Douglas Daly, my co-PI in that National Cancer Institute program, and here he's working with, he's a specialist in the frankincense family, the Burseraceae, and here he has a new species of Burseraceae in his hand. He really ran the random survey part of that study. And what was interesting is setting up those plots in so many different countries, he found 54 new species of trees that were previously not known to science. In fact, we averaged 1% of everything we touched in those forests as being new to science. So it's not just finding new medicines, but it's finding new species. The second strategy, biological activity, is, as in this example, a person grabs a branch, gets a drop of sap on their hand. This is from the fig family. And a few moments later, a welt appears, a burn appears. And that's a subtle indicator of biological activity, right? Because it does something to the skin. Now, this is a graduate student collecting these plants. This is what we have graduate students for, to sort of test these things on themselves when they're collecting things and not wearing gloves. But what I do is mostly work with indigenous cultures. These are the Kayapo Indians, the children in the front, the adults in the back, and they are celebrating the harvest of corn in their village. And if you notice, these people are wearing their traditional garb. You see the red face paint from a plant called Bixa orellana. Anybody use Aveda products? One is called Uruku lipstick, that red lipstick. They learned about that from these people. But I don't work with people who still are holding on to their culture in this way. These people probably have several more generations before they lose their cultural knowledge of plants. Instead, I work with people such as this. This man is Don Eligio Panti, who I began to work with in 1987, 86. He was a great Maya healer, but he lived on the fringes of civilization. In other words, the surrounding civilization was really eroding away at traditional Maya culture. and he had no apprentice. He'd been practicing for 60 years. In this picture, he's 87 years old. He died just around 100 years of age. This is what's called salvage ethnobotany, going into a community and trying to gather as much information as possible and trying to build linkages with younger people so that they will begin to study with these folks. And the Maya people, in fact, many of the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica, before the Spanish conquest, were quite sophisticated. In fact, most historians would argue that they had more sophisticated cultures than the Spanish conquistadores. And this is a mural from the Hospital de la Raza in Mexico City by Diego Rivera. This mural is called La Historia de Medicina, and this is a piece from it where the elder healer is teaching the apprentice. And these images are from the codices that these people produced. The codices, the great books of images and information, in this case on their healing power. Now the Maya had schools of healing. They had medical schools. They had extensive libraries. They had a system of mathematics and astronomy that was far superior to those of the Spanish who conquered them. But the Spanish were more powerful, and they wanted to establish New Spain in this region, and so they banned things like these medical schools because they were tied with religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs that these people had. So the codices, thousands and thousands of great books in their libraries, were burned by the Spanish. And in the case of medicine, only 2 books remain today, one in the Vatican and one in Guatemala. So what happened, starting around 500 years ago, is that these formal traditions, university traditions, were banned. You were executed if you were caught teaching about medicine, teaching a mother teaching her daughter in a formal setting about the plants that they would need on their path to womanhood. And it went underground. It became secret. You would have to teach this out of the earshot of the soldiers, of the conquistadores. So what happened was written tradition transferred to oral tradition. And that worked for centuries and centuries and centuries until recently. And this is the same story everywhere in the world, virtually everywhere. I was talking to a taxi driver in Belize in the 1980s when I first got there. And he said, "You know, what are you here for?" I said, "Well, I'm studying bush medicine." And he said, "You know, my grandfather was a great healer. He went into the forest all the time, and he raised us on these medicines." He said, "My father learned a little bit from him, but me, I was afraid to go into the forest. I wanted a car. I wanted to drink out of cans. I wanted a cassette player. Those are the things that I aspired for. And now that I have all that, I really, really am sorry that I didn't listen to the lessons of my ancestors." And so the shift from written tradition to oral tradition, in the last 30 or 40 years, that chain has been broken, and we try to rebuild that chain. So I'd like to start the story with Belize, Central America. How many of you have been there? Belize? Wonderful, wonderful place. When I got a letter from this woman on the right, after these contracts were announced from the Cancer Institute to the Botanical Garden, her name is Dr. Rosita Vigo. She's a naturopathic physician. Naturopathy is an offshoot of chiropractic, which involves nutrition and manipulation. She came from Chicago with her husband, Dr. Shropshire, to open a practice in Belize because in the 70s, because in that time the practice was illegal in the United States. She met up with this old man, Don Eligio Ponte, and they became friends. And she wrote me a letter saying, you know, I met this old man. He's a hamen, or healer priest, the highest level of healer in Maya culture. And he has no apprentice, and he's been teaching me. But I don't know how to make the plant specimens. I don't know how to make the drawings. I don't know how to document this. I'm a doctor. I need someone to work on collecting these plants and telling me what they are. So the wonderful thing about my job at the New York Botanical Garden is that I can drop everything and just go somewhere if an opportunity presents itself. And 2 weeks later, I was down on Dr. Shropshire and Dr. Arvigo's farm talking with Donna Lihio, and we decided to put a project together. So he said, it was very interesting. He said, you know, your culture doesn't respect we Maya people. The people in the schools, the doctors, the religious people, they say we consort with the devil because we talk to the Maya spirits. We invoke the Maya spirits in our healing. But he said, but we're good people. We treat our patients. We heal people. In fact, when the doctors, the priests, the teachers can't find healing in Western medicine, they come to me. And he said, so maybe, just maybe, as you've come to me and said your culture can't deal with these diseases such as AIDS and cancer, maybe by me helping you, in the name of my ancestors, I can build a bridge between the Maya people and Western pharmacy and get more respect for my people. And I will work with you until I've taught you everything I know. So the three of us, Rosita Vigo, Donna Lihio Ponte, and myself, became a team that worked together for 15 years, collecting plants, documenting knowledge. This was an example of his medicine. Roots, berries, bark, chopped up. This is what he called La Farmacia. And this was in a very simple house, his house, no electricity, no windows, no glass, no running water, very simple. He would keep the plant mixtures in bags, and then he had this tuber here, and this is in the genus Dioscorea. And what's interesting is 1,000 years ago, the Maya would use this tuber to gain energy after they were sick. They called it to build the blood. And it wasn't until the 1950s that the chemist Russell Marker discovered that inside that tuber, the Dioscorea tuber, was a compound called diosgenin, and pharmacologists developed cortisone from this. The whole steroid industry developed from that plant. And you know what steroids are good for as far as building the body, building the blood, right? I mean, you read about this in the sports pages every day, right? But steroids have a very important place in medicine. And I would submit to you that if we looked at the other 350 plants in these bags in a very systematic way, we would find many, many gifts from nature that are still remaining to be discovered and used. Here, Donna Lihio is feeling the pulse of one of his patients that presented with gastritis, with a stomach problem. And we learned that pulse diagnosis of the Maya people was once very important. He could feel your pulse and describe your condition ranging from perfect health to impending death. He had 27 different pulses that he recognized. It takes a lifetime to learn this. He couldn't teach this to Rosita. I was giving this lecture in China, and people got up and said, you know, we have pulse diagnosis too in ancient Chinese medicine. The same lecture in India, somebody got up and said, you know, Indian Ayurvedic medicine, we do pulse diagnosis. And I compared them, and there was a huge overlap between the conditions that these peoples could diagnose. So a very interesting question. We wrote an article about this in the Journal of Alternative Medicine. How did people who are on 3 separate continents develop this system, this diagnostic system? I'm a botanist. Here are some plants. Anybody know this plant family? The Asteraceae, the daisy family, but good call. The buds are closed, so it looks just like it. This one is called Neurolena lobata. In Creole, we call it jackass bitters because it's so bitter only a jackass would take it. It's full of something called sesquiterpene lactones, which kill parasites, including malaria. So if you get a case of traveler's diarrhea in Mexico or Belize or Guatemala, just chew on these leaves and it'll kill those parasites. Anybody know this one? Aristolochia, in this case the species grandiflora, because that flower is 18 inches long. That flower comes attached to a woody vine in the background, and that vine is soaked in rum and consumed as a tonic. In fact, if you go to any bar in Belize on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning, there's a line for people who want to have a shot of this plant in the rum to get rid of their hangover. And we don't know if it's the rum or the plant, but it really is something that boosts your immunity and your resistance. However, the lesson from this plant is that all that is natural is not all that is good. So Aristolochia contains something called aristolochic acid, which is a tumor promoter. And when this plant was mistakenly put in some herbal remedies for weight loss, there were 7 cases of people who got kidney tumors, kidney cancer, and they had to have transplants. So always use these herbs under the supervision of a person knowledgeable, a knowledgeable physician. We never recommend that these are just used on your own or off the internet. Here's another interesting plant. The Maya people say that the cure is always put near the scourge. And this is probably the worst plant in Central America, Metopium brownii. It's a tree poison ivy. You get this black sap on your skin, 1 drop, and 24 hours later you're covered with poison ivy. Hard to get rid of. The only thing that'll get rid of it is the bark of Gumbo Limbo, Bursera cimaruba. You rip the bark off, there's this white cream underneath, you rub it where the black sap fell on you, and you don't get further dermatitis. Very interesting. Why would these grow together? We set up ecological plots all over Belize. They always grow together. So there are a lot of really interesting beliefs that you would throw away as folklore, wives' tales, but they turn out to be true. So it's very interesting studying this. We looked at 361 patients of Don Eligio. He had a patient load of about 3,500 people a year. And that's equivalent to a primary health care physician in New York. He was responsible for 3,500 people a year. This is their age range. And what you see here is he would be what's called a general practitioner. Everybody from kids to the oldest people in the village. Where did they come from? Well, it turns out that his reputation was so powerful that they would come from overseas, from other countries to visit him. They would walk barefoot over mountains. They would take canoes. They would take buses, ride in the back of trucks, take airplanes. You see here they came from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico, to see this old man that lived in this little hut along a muddy road that could cure them, could heal their problems, who had no apprentice until Rosita Vigo came along and devoted her life to being his apprentice. Why did they come to him? Stomach ache, 12%, muscular, skeletal, 7%, malaise, 7%, headache, 5%, weakness in legs, 4%, crying hysteria, 4%, fright, 4%, romantic enchantments, 4%, bad luck, 4%, 49% other conditions. Now, we laugh because you would go to a doctor for fright or hysteria or bad luck. Those are psychiatric conditions, right? Imagine a panic anxiety attack, a case of depression. In fact, we found that only about 50% of the things that he treated had physical causes. A tree falls on your arm and breaks your arm. Many of these things had spiritual causes. And in fact, we found that spiritual diseases, spiritual conditions are very, very, very important in that part of the world. And the treatments involved spiritual modalities. What were the spiritual ailments? Things like susto, fright, pesar, grief, tristeza, sadness, envy, evil eye, bad winds. Why is this important? Because as immigrant communities come to other countries, they bring culture-bound syndromes with them. And this is the recent copy, most recent copy of the American Psychiatric Association Manual, the DSM-4, the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Conditions. And in it, there's a whole chapter on culture-bound syndromes that if you were a practitioner, let's say in our neighborhood in the Bronx, you would have to treat mal de ojo or susto. Because I have seen people get very, very, very sick from these culture-bound syndromes. And you have to, as a physician, recognize these and treat them. So we have a program at the Botanical Garden where we work with people at Einstein, Montefiore, Bronx VA, and Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons to train both the physicians and the medical students in recognizing culturally specific or culture-bound syndromes. These are recurrent locality-specific patterns of aberrant behavior and troubling experience. In the realm of psychiatry and in the realm of internal medicine, they're of course different, but they both share this quality of not having a one-to-one correspondence with a typical illness that a person in the medical school here might be trained to recognize. They just don't correspond. So we gather this kind of information and we teach it in our physician education programs as well. That's an important part of this work. But basically, I'm a botanist, and we sit in the mud. People romanticize this. How many of you saw the movie Medicine Man? Remember that movie? It was very, very exciting, and the guy was living in the Amazon, right? Remember that? Yeah, and he had an HPLC in the middle of nowhere. He wrote for a research assistant, and Lorraine Bracco paddles up to be his research assistant. Remember that? And the first thing she says was, you know, we've funded you for 12 years and you've never sent us a report. That to me is like the greatest thing in the world, to have a funder never ask for a report. But basically, it's not romantic. We sit in the mud, we collect plants, we're away from our families, we're living under suboptimal conditions, but we get the data because it's fascinating to us. That's what drives us, this fascination. How many of you in first grade collected leaves and pressed them between wax paper? People still do it. So everyone, right? So imagine, for me, 50 years later, I'm still doing that, right? And these specimens last hundreds and hundreds of years. That's how we document this. And then we collect the bulk samples for presentation to the Cancer Institute, and of course their goal was to find the next vincristine or vinblastine, as in this case from the rosy periwinkle. So they're off on a search, and it'll take many, many decades to look through the plants that we've collected. Now, I'm very interested in conservation and economic development and sustainability, so I was observing that these people have a market for these plants, not when the NCI develops them, but they sell the plants in their markets and they use them for healing. And what I noticed is they would sell these bags of plants that they collect in the forest, and then they'd burn the forest down and plant corn, beans, and rice. So we sort of asked the question, what's the value of the plants? What if you manage them sustainably? And what if you didn't burn the forest down? So we did these transects in 30 and 50-year-old rainforest in Belize. And we did a calculation with an economist from Yale, Rob Mendelson, on net present value. Net present value means what's the value of this activity or piece of land or property now and into the future if you carry out this same activity, right? So the first plot, the 30-year-old forest, the net present value was $726 a hectare, right? About 2.5 acres. This 50-year-old forest had a value of $3,327 a hectare. And then we compared that to cutting and burning forest in Brazil and Guatemala, and we found that if we could sustainably manage the forest, have people harvest these plants and sell them, they could make 2 to 10 times as much money as if they could burn, as compared to the people who were burning the forests. Okay, and that was a significant discovery because Belize is a great country for conservation. There's a bird sanctuary, there's a howler monkey sanctuary, there's a butterfly sanctuary. And the healers went to the government and said, everyone has a forest reserve but the medicinal plants. And we've just shown that they have a value. So they got this allocation of land from the government and created the world's first ethnobiomedical forest reserve where they could grow their plants, develop sustainable harvest protocols, and teach their children. And since that time, and again, that work stopped in the late 1990s when the contract ended. But since that time, we've held a bush medicine camp for kids every year in Belize, every summer. And here are two of the campers. About 20 campers live with healers and people called bushmasters who are very savvy about the ways of the forest. And these are city kids, often families at risk, children of families at risk. And here they learn to plant trees, to respect nature. What's really interesting to me is when I first got to Belize in 1986, the mantra was 50 acres and a machete. You could get 50 acres as long as you cut it down. And if you saw a snake, you killed it. And if there was anything green, you cut it down so you could plant corn. These children are being taught to plant trees that will not yield medicines until they have children or even grandchildren. So the kids of today are planting trees for their grandchildren. And what a wonderful metaphor that is, right? So it's been a very, very interesting place to work, and really these programs have made a difference in that country. I'd like to switch gears and go to a different part of the world. I don't know if you can see this yellow line. This is New York, where we are. You fly to Hawaii, and that yellow circle's the area of the world called Micronesia, from the Greek small islands. There are 2,000 of the little tiny islands. That's where I work now primarily. So that's a 22-hour flight in a jet to this island called Pohnpei in the Eastern Caroline Islands. And Pohnpei has 5 little kingdoms. It's 130 square miles. 5 kingdoms and 30,000 people. And I started working there in 1997, trying to bring some of the lessons, the successes and the mistakes that we made in Belize to a very remote part of the world. Why are these areas important if you're a conservationist? Well, 76% of the native plants are endemic, found nowhere else on the planet. And that makes Pohnpei Island one of the most significant biodiversity hotspots on the world based on endemic plants. Okay? Volcanic islands. 5 million years ago, these volcanoes pushed up through the Pacific, and slowly vegetation covered them. About 700 meters in elevation, home to the lowest cloud forest in the world, 700 meters. Usually cloud forest is about 2,000 meters. So the clouds go through these mountains and all sorts of unique vegetation is found. Surrounded by atolls, such as this atoll, Mokiloa. And these are only about 3 feet above the sea level, which means they're endangered by sea rise. We do the same thing in Micronesia as we did in Belize. We sit at the feet of elders, collect plants, gather traditional knowledge, and try to interest young people in this activity. The wonderful thing about Micronesia and working on small islands is there is a terrestrial marine interface. Everything's an island. You're surrounded by thousands and thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean. Imagine an area the size of the United States as the ocean, and then about 1,800 square miles, roughly the size of the state of Delaware, as the only land area in that United States, broken up into 400 or 500 or 600 islands, some the size of this room. It's fascinating. And I learned to do stuff like underwater ethnobotany, here learning about sea plants. So we were able to both exploit knowledge of land and sea. Here's a fascinating plant to me, Cinnamomum carolinense. This is a cinnamon. Everybody knows what cinnamon is, right? Well, this one is only found in an area of a couple square miles on this island. That's the only place in the world it grows. And this man, Yosio Pelep, is a cinnamon harvester because they use this plant to get rid of lower back pain. It's a tea, a traditional tea used for lower back pain. He noticed that the harvest method, that is splitting the bark off the trees, would kill the trees. And there are only a little tiny population left in the whole world. And so on his own, he developed a way of scraping the bark on one side with a machete and getting these little fragments in such a way that 6 months later the bark would grow back. This farmer developed a method of sustainable harvest of an important Pohnpeian resource that's only found in this one little tiny area. Very interesting to work with this guy. People are developing ways of managing resources in sustainable fashions. What's interesting about this is I collaborate with a lot of chemists. One of my graduate students studied the tea made from this plant, and it had a high concentration of a compound called safrole, which is a cancer promoter. So we thought, God, these people are poisoning themselves. Why would they be drinking this and calling it medicine, and why aren't they getting cancer? Well, we prepared the tea in a traditional way, boiling it, decanting off the water, throwing away the bark, and we found no safrole in the tea. So not only has this man developed a sustainable method of producing this important crop, or this wild forest crop, tree, but indigenous technologies, without chemistry labs, have figured out how to knock the the cancer-causing compound out of this plant and make it a perfectly safe, effective medicinal beverage. Fascinating to me. Think about that. But by far, my favorite plant on the island of Pohnpei isn't a plant. It's a mushroom, a completely different kingdom. Mushrooms are not plants. They're mushrooms. This one is called Sollong, ear of the ghost. It is an important mushroom. You put it on your elbow when you get pain there, or on your arm. But very interestingly, when it gets dark at night, it is a bioluminescent species. This is the first photograph of Philecology manipularis ever taken in the bioluminescent stage. It took me 2 nights, and this was a 5-hour exposure with 1600 speed film, if that means anything to anybody anymore. Mothers teach their children to be nice children by threatening them with Sollong and Eni. If you fight with your sister, I'm going to take you into the backyard and the ghost of Sollong and Eni is going to get you, right? So there are these cultural prescriptions that go around Sollong and Eni. A more practical use, however, than sort of keeping your children in line is, let's say you're in the forest at night, there's no full moon, your torch goes out. In the old days, your flashlight in the current days. The leader will cover himself or herself with these mushrooms and lead the group out. It's a fascinating plant. But by far the most important plant species is Kava, Piper Mysticum. How many of you have ever tried Kava? So this is a plant with anxiolytic properties, meaning reducing anxiety. It's a very powerful plant with compounds called kavalactones, but most importantly, this plant holds the culture of Pohnpei together. This is the plant in a society that treats respect as the most important commodity on the island. Kava is more important than the king, because Kava is the ultimate respect. If you have a problem that you need to resolve between two families, you'll bring the Kava branch to the king and you'll throw it down before him. He has to stop what he's doing, go with you, and resolve the problem over cups of Kava. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. The roots are where the kavalactones are found. The people pound the roots. This is a shrub about 15 feet high. You'll see that it's pounded in a very special way. Men without shirts on, because if you have, this plant is so sacred that if you have a fungal infection or a cut, you're not allowed to pound. This plant is not allowed to fall on the floor, so this leaf of Alocasia mycorrhizas is put all around the table. This is a sacred stone from one part of Pohnpei, and it rings when you pound it. You hear this pounding of a rock on the stone, and people start to come from everywhere because everyone's welcome to drink Kava when it's pounded. On the island of Pohnpei, it's put in a hibiscus stem and mixed with a little bit of water and squeezed into a coconut shell. And can you see this consistency is sort of like maple syrup, right? So it's like bitter maple syrup on this island because it has the goo of the hibiscus. Now, everyone's eaten okra, right? You know how sort of gooey it is? Well, this hibiscus bark has that same consistency times 10. So you mix that with the kava root, and you get this sort of syrupy, gooey beverage. And you present it to the king in a certain ritualistic way. The king always sits above the commoner. And what's fascinating, we did a survey of several hundred people on the island, and that most drink sakao, or kava. Sakao is the Pohnpeian name. They spend 4, 5, 6 hours a week drinking it on average. They drink 7 or 8 or 9 cups per sitting. It's a lot of kava, a lot of sakao. And when they're doing this, they're talking stories. You start drinking it, you start talking stories. You start telling your children what it was like in the old days. You start imparting lessons for how to navigate through life. You ask your children or your friend, do you have a problem? Let's talk about it. This is such a powerful plant, as I'll show you in a moment, that you cannot do anything but love the people around you and have compassion for them when you're drinking it. It's ideal for resolving conflict. It's also used in Western medicine, herbal medicine, for the treatment of anxiety. There are millions of people with clinical anxiety in this country. Here's a study with about 200 milligrams of Kava lactones. On a 6-week study, the score is the Hamilton Anxiety Score. This is a self-scoring document where you're checking off, are you sweating? Do things make you nervous? Are you having trouble sleeping? And then it's being compared with oxazepam, which is similar to Valium. It's the same class of drugs, the diazepam class, the oxazepam class, a diazepine class of drugs. And that's mostly what's given for anxiety, or one of the things that's given for anxiety in this country. And it shows that Kava is just as effective. And it doesn't have the addictive, stupefying qualities that a Valium has. It's very, very interesting. It's a very powerful medication. Kills anxiety. By the way, I use the Hamilton Anxiety Score pre-test and after test with my students. It's amazing. You know, you score yourself as being anxious before an exam, and you take the same test a couple hours later, no anxiety whatsoever. So that's a self-scoring device, instrument. So what we're doing in Dr. Miriam Baumschad's lab at CUNY is we're feeding Kava to voles. Now, voles are very interesting. Prairie voles, these little things that dig under the ground. Could you tell us what they are? I don't know anything about animals. Prairie voles, do they have them here?
No, they're not here.
They're out in the west somewhere? Yeah, okay. But they exhibit social behavior that's similar to humans, such as pair bonding. They bond for life, whereas mice will not do that. And because scientists have put a lot of effort into understanding their brain structure, their neuronal pathways, they're a really good laboratory animal to study the effects of something like this on social behavior. And what we found in the lab for the first time is feeding these animals sakao reduces anxiety levels and very characteristic social behaviors. And as we get further and further into this, understanding the mechanisms by which Kava and these Kava lactones exert these forces on vole brains may help us understand or provide insights into the human conditions involving social behavior, autism, social anxiety, schizophrenia. This work could impact our understanding of those conditions. But back to Ponape for a moment. The medically recommended dose is 100 to 200 milligrams of Kava lactones per day. And the active Kava lactone is called dihydrokavane. Based on our studies, this is the Pohnpeian dose per sitting. 2,100 milligrams of Kava lactones. These are very, very relaxed people, right? It's astonishing. You know, I just want to take this to the United Nations and have everybody sit down. Pohnpeians are funny people. They photoshopped a picture of George Bush and Osama bin Laden together over a Kava stone, resolving everything. I don't have that with me. But here are the sort of take-home messages. Remember we talked about random samples versus medicinal plants. I worked with Don Slish up in Plattsburgh, and we found that in Belize, on a smooth muscle relaxant screen, with medicinal plants, we could get about a 13% hit rate. With random samples, we got nothing. So it seems to play out in certain conditions. Another take-home lesson is that I recognize local participants as co-authors and full colleagues, equal colleagues. These people may not be literate. They may not have a PhD. They may just be folks from the neighborhood, healers. But they're authors on all my papers. Don Eligio Ponte, when we asked him about an anti-cancer activity, he said, go study that plant over there. And indeed, in this plant, Psychotria acuminata, we discovered a novel mechanism for that has an impact on tumor formation. So he was an author of that, co-author of that paper. He couldn't read it. He couldn't talk about the lab stuff. But he put that paper on his wall, and anyone who walked into his clinic, he said, soy garantizado. I'm guaranteed because I do things like this. It's wonderful to see people get excited by sharing intellectual benefits of this work. Another sort of purpose for this is the integration of ethnomedicine and allopathic medicine into what Andrew Weil 20 years ago called integrative medicine. And integrative medicine is now taught at 40% of all medical schools in this country. It is evidence-based traditional practices such as herbs or yoga or other things combined with allopathic modalities. It's a very interesting branch of medicine. But we know that these plants and this knowledge is also good for people's health. So in this case, as part of our survey of 150 people, you got to work with me on this a little bit. This part is traditional knowledge, least to most. This part is as you age, youngest to oldest. And this part is quality of life, from best is lowest, worst is highest. And what we found was as you get older, the more traditional knowledge you have, you see the yellow circle or the green circle, the more traditional knowledge you have, as you age, the better your quality of life is. Okay? But what was fascinating is where that yellow arrow is. You see that little valley in there? Everybody see that? Those are people in their 50s. Those are people who were young kids when the United States of America took over that island in 1945, when it became an American possession, and introduced the American diet. White rice, Spam, canned fish, canned peas, Budweiser beer, all the things that are imported to that island. What happens is that the people that grew up on that diet have diabetes. They have heart conditions. The elders who avoided that diet and still went in canoes and exercised and didn't sit in front of the TV all day and didn't have government jobs where they just sat in front of a screen, they're fine. It's the people that embraced our lifestyle, the lifestyle that we exported, are the ones, regardless of traditional knowledge, they're in trouble. That was fascinating. That's really, really important. Another lesson, I work with folks, and this Ioannis Rasa, the late Ioannis Rasa on the right, his wife Maria, we would go out and collect every day with them, and then we'd go back and sit on his little porch overlooking 5,000 miles of Pacific Ocean as far as you could see. And I'd recognize some of the plants, and I'd say, you know, in Mexico, they use it for this, and Belize, they use it for that. And so he would start writing stuff. And I said, what are you doing? He goes, well, what did you say you used that plant for where you worked before? I said, well, we use it for headache, and he'd write it down. I said, what are you doing? He said, you know, you've come here to interview us and document our knowledge, but it turns out you have a lot of knowledge too. And you're not a young man. You're not going to live forever. And we've got to document your knowledge before you leave us. So what was fascinating to me was the sort of inversion of this investigator-interviewee relationship. So in the morning we did my thing. In the afternoon we talked about his thing. As Mary mentioned, I've worked around the world with different traditional cultures, and I always ask, as a conservationist, how best to conserve nature. And people say, well, first, you've got to have self-respect. You really have to respect yourself, and they respect themselves on Pohnpei. And then you have to respect your culture. You have to stand up for your roots and respect who you are. And then and only then can you work on respecting the environment, which is why I think this program here is so important. Okay? I asked this question in China, in Belize, in India, in Thailand, all over the world I ask this question. I get the same answer: self-respect, cultural respect, environmental respect. So, as a biologist, You know, I work in the biosphere. We inventory plants, we write down their names, we look at organisms, we look at ecology, the relationships between species. We do lots and lots of things that look at species, including humans. But as Wade Davis called it, the ethnosphere is equally as important in this work. The ethnosphere is the sum total of human culture, knowledge, information about dance, about literature. You know, the difference between the Oxford Dictionary and Shakespeare and a volume of Shakespeare. It's that knowledge that we have, the ethnosphere, that's not captured. And so what I try to do is to work at the intersection of the ethnosphere and the biosphere and try and preserve biological diversity and cultural diversity through this research. And I think this is part of the key to the future, because as we talked about in the very beginning, we're doing a terrible, terrible job managing the environment. We have to find new ways. We have to train new people. This has to be done. There is no choice. So I'd like to end with a story of this woman, Mary David, on the island of Pohnpei. Mary was a healer for 60 years. And she lived in a little village on the island of Soques. And down the road from her was a dispensary. Do you know what a dispensary is? Like the nurse's office, right? You go when you're sick, you have a stomach ache, you go to the village dispensary, and the folks trained by the University of Hawaii Medical School are there, and they're diagnosing things like diarrhea. 6 million kids primarily die from diarrheal infections every year. They would diagnose that, and you would get your medicine in the dispensary. Well, on an island like this, when the field ship doesn't show up, it is very common for the dispensaries to be empty. Okay, so people die because the dispensary is empty. They don't have access to proper health care. Mary showed us this plant, the cure for diarrhea, that she'd been using for 60 years until she passed away a few years ago. That plant was growing all around the dispensary, but they had no medications in the dispensary for diarrhea. Tough luck, right? You lose fluid, you die. So it turned out that her great-grandchildren were the medical officers. So part of what we did in this project was to reintroduce her to her great-grandchildren and have her explain to them that the plants that grow around your dispensary can be used to treat people when you don't have pharmaceutical medications. In fact, we put together a primary healthcare manual from plants for 12 of the most important conditions that people face on these islands. Wounds, bites and stings, diarrhea, intestinal problems, etc. So again, just like with Don Eligio, bridging that gap between ancient and modern. Ancient medicine, modern medicine. Ancient wisdom, modern needs. Reintroducing grandparents to their grandchildren and transmitting that knowledge so it's not lost into the ethnosphere as the ethnosphere dissolves. And that's really the essence of this work, the importance of it, the broader impact. So thank you very much for listening and inviting me here. And gosh, I'm happy to take some questions. If you want to put the...
Thanks for coming. My name's Peter, and I'm wondering if you know, back to the slide about productivity in economic terms of hectare based on age of the forest. Is that linked to age of tree species, or like another community? Another community element of age?
No, a 30-year-old forest and a 50-year-old forest.
Right, but specifically the trees, or other plants in that community of the forest
Both,
that have
both.
evolved in a
Something that was cleared 30 years ago and allowed to grow back, something that was cleared 50 years ago and allowed to grow back. So all of the little stuff, the vines, the tubers, all of that was cleared out. Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Yes?
How does NCI and York Botanical Garden play a role in protecting, let's say, the intellectual property rights of shamans and what they've developed, say, vinblastine and vinblastine, and then other people go and patent it and say it's theirs?
Did everyone hear that question? Do you want to project that?
Yeah. My question was, how does NCI and New York Botanical Garden play a role in protecting the intellectual rights to the medications that they are learned from the shamans?
So that's a really important question in this work. How do you protect the intellectual property that is traditional knowledge? And we have worked very carefully and very intensively with teams of lawyers, with indigenous cultures, with botanists, with our administrators, to develop protocols for intellectual property issues. We were the first group to really develop a series of intellectual property contracts and benefit sharing agreements. We spent Jim Miller, who's our dean now, but formerly at the Missouri Botanical Garden, and I co-chaired the American committee that ended up developing these agreements that would ensure that anything that a person at a botanical garden or a museum or a similar institution would find would have benefits to these communities. Interestingly enough, the government, 10, 15 years before we did this, the government, through a man named Gordon Cragg, was insistent that these protocols be developed before we collected a single plant. So the National Cancer Institute pioneered the development of these intellectual property agreements. And one of the joys about putting someone's name on a scientific publication is that that also shows intellectual property rights and partnerships. So yeah, the concept of intellectual property has really guided the trajectory of all of our work.
Sort of go off of last question is, I was sort of thinking throughout your entire presentation.
I don't think they can hear you.
Sort of like the ethical implications to some degree of, well, first off, how the role of the Western society has had in actually destroying these languages, as you say, and you coming in and trying to rebuild them, which is interesting. But also, when I was taking intro economics, we talked a lot about, sustainable coffee planting and how when you buy Starbucks now, a lot of it is
Fair trade.
right, fair trade, thank you, and all of that. And it sort of struck me that as good as that is, it can almost sort of reinforce the behaviors of our society that created that situation. And how do you, as an ethnobotanist, say to people, look at what important work this has done, and not have them think, well, it's important because it benefits us, and it's not important for your own kids also.
Very, very, very important series of questions. For example, in Belize, the healers got together and formed an association of traditional healers. And we were able to support that. And they decided what we would do because we were a community of researchers and healers. They decided how monies would be spent. They came up with the idea of a conservation camp for their children. They wanted me to write a book called Rainforest Remedies before really I did a lot of the research so that they would have a little book that they could use to teach their children. And in fact, I was in Belize maybe 5 years ago after the hurricane, and I was on a tour. Belize has a lot of tour guides now, people who are making, young people who are professional tour guides, and they found out that, oh yeah, I was the one that wrote that book, and this young man comes up to me and says, that's my Bible. He said, my dad's gone, mom's gone, grandparents are gone. This is the only way I know about the knowledge that I can talk about to the tourists. He said, but the hurricane took my books out to sea. Can you send me more books? And what was interesting is that in 1987, when we published that book, Rosita and I took second mortgages on our houses, such that we would pay for the publication and devote the royalties to the 11 healers that helped us write the book, or channeled their knowledge through us. And that book raised $35,000 US over about a 10-year period. And we set up a pension fund for the healers. They could do whatever they wanted. They got a payment twice a year in US dollars. 35,000 US dollars, 70,000 Belize dollars. And what was fascinating to me is what people did with their money. Every 6 months they'd get a check. Probably the equivalent in our society to 4 months' salary. Big check from the sales of this little book. One of them one of the ladies bought 6 sewing machines so that the ladies in her village could start a little business. One of them wanted a toilet inside her house. Imagine the concept of that. Put a toilet in her house. One of the ladies, her husband used to beat her up pretty badly because he was the guy, right? So what she did, very smart, she opened a little restaurant with her money, and she became the breadwinner. And that husband is so attentive to her. He was so nice, peace in the house. One of them bought uniforms and books for the kids, because in Belize you have to pay for school. So one of them drank it up in alcohol. It's not for me to judge, So that kind of stuff is some of the models that we developed that more people should be adopting. Now, I don't know of anybody who took a mortgage on their house to write a book so that it could be sold and people that they worked with as informants or whatever benefited. But Rosita and I were able to pay off our second mortgages. That book sold probably 20,000 copies down in Belize, and everything's fine. But it's sort of entrepreneurial things like that that can help people. And I think your question, it's really complicated to say there's a linear answer, point A to point B. Ben and Jerry's used to roll into the Amazonian rainforest and collect all of Brazil nuts and then sell Rainforest Crunch. Anybody remember that ice cream? Yeah? Now, the problem is that when you take all the seeds out of the Brazil nut population, you get a population curve that's completely inverse of what it should be. A lot of old trees, no new trees. So what happens 20 years from now to that population of trees? Gone, right. So we thought we were doing good by eating Rainforest Crunch. Ben and Jerry's thought they were doing really good by selling it, but the environment, took it in the chin. So that's why this kind of program to really understand and model sustainability and look at all the social factors, the cultural factors, the economic factors. I don't talk about global warming. I talk about global change. The economy changes. The weather changes. The price of gasoline changes. That's what this program was developed to sort out. And again, if we don't sort it out, we should move to another planet, in my opinion. So, yes?
Mike, with the popularity of Kava consumption, are they conserving the resource?
Interesting question. Kava is grown in many places in the Pacific, but Pohnpeians seem to drink more Kava per capita than anyone else in the world. And for a while there, they were destroying the upland forests to grow Kava. And my friend Bill Rayner, who lives in Pohnpei, he's the Nature Conservancy's manager for the Pacific and Asia. He used to just be the manager for Micronesia. And what he decided to do maybe 20 years ago was take an aerial map. This is what our forest looked like in 1975. This is what it looked like in 1995. 75, it had 42% forest cover. 95, it had 15%. And he took that all around. He put it on a poster, all around Micronesia, all around Pohnpei. And he said, look, you growing Kava up there, we have no more forest. We don't have any forest, you don't have any watershed, you don't have any watershed. We have no water on this island. And suddenly the elders and the young people said, you're right, you know? And so he developed a campaign with the local conservation agencies. The Nature Conservancy is wonderful in linking with local agencies, called Grow Low. So they took Kava back to the lowlands, and it grows just fine. And in the 1995 to 2005, there was only a 3% loss of forest, which is, you know, more than half of what it was. So, great question. Again, modeling becomes so important. Yes?
Do you think that there's a level of intuition that a good herbalist or a good shaman has that it is actually a little bit beyond, because you were mentioning how remarkable it is that some of this knowledge exists. And how do you have your own personal ideas about how it exists and whether it will take particular kinds of people who carry the tradition on?
Sure. You know, I find physicians, older ones, to be more intuitive and smarter sometimes than younger ones. I've gotten to the point where my physicians are all younger than I am. It's like really weird. But every profession has that level of sort of intuitive getting it, you know, and traditional healing and allopathic medicine, they're no different. Earlier today we were talking about dreams. I have extensive videotapes of all these healers. I would sit and tape them. And one of them tells a story of how he had a patient suffering from diabetic retinopathy, blindness. He didn't call it he said blindness. And he said he didn't know what to do. It was a kind of blindness. And he went into the forest, he meditated, a vision came into his head, and the vision was snail, freshwater snail. And he went to the stream that he was sitting next to, got the snails, chopped their heads off, put them in a little bowl and parched them, sort of sauteed them, I guess. And then he used that to make a medicine, and he said that the woman got better, right? And of course, I'm just listening. I can't really find out where she is or who she is. But I showed the video to my teacher of Chinese medicine, Professor Wang, and he started getting all excited, and he kept his copy of Ben Sao Gumbo in the house, this ancient Chinese herbal, and he went to page 147, I'm making that number up, and he said, look, freshwater snail for the treatment of blindness. We knew about this in China 3,000 years ago. And I'm sitting there going, what? You know, I can't get my arms around it. I really can't get my arms around that. You know, as a scientist, I don't know what to do with it. I can report it. You know, maybe the ethnosphere, the cosmic consciousness is a lot more active than I understand. But how do you get two peoples from two very separate communities doing the same thing? You know, I don't know. But certainly mind-body stuff is very important. And I've written a number of papers on things that we've found that shouldn't work, that do, because there is a very strong component of belief. Does that answer the question, or? Yeah? Okay, you'll tell me the answer to my question later? About how that happened? Yes, somebody.
I was just sort of in response to what you said about how two distinct cultures would know about first of all, snails and limas. I read a lot about pedagogy, and a lot of sort of very progressive pedagogy emphasizes the need to explore other modalities of thinking outside of sort of the Western linear scientific sort of method, isolation, and that when you focus solely along that line of thinking, you lose sort of, I mean, when you're talking about the ethnosphere and the loss of cultural knowledge, you're also losing cultural ways of thinking that, provide you with.
Explanations.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah. Unfortunately, in my setting as a scientist, I'm prescribed to think and explain in one way.
Right.
But it is a joy for me to sit with people in other cultures and other parts of the world and understand how they explain things. It's just fun. Yeah.
I think at this point, we'll close the formal part of this. I thank you all for being a rapt audience, but it's really easy when Michael Balick is talking. I think it's really been a privilege to spend some time participating in his worldview and learning about new ways of understanding ethnobotany.